Planning and Modeling, published by BDM Publishing House Limited. He is editor of the journal Transport Policy, Elsevier, associate editor of Urban Rail Transit, Stranger, and Journal of Modern Mobility Systems, Machine Publishing. He is the founding and current president of the Society Transportation Research Group of India. He is presently serving as steering committee member of World Conference on Transport Research Society, based in University of Leeds, UK. He is also co-chair of Special Interest Group H2 and G5 of WCTRS, which are focused on transportation in developing economics and disaster resilience. So, with this little brief introduction, I would like to share the floor with Dr. Anjas Verma. So, now, sir, this is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ambika. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Thanks for this nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present some of the technical work and some ideas that we have on sustainable transport to the August gathering, and to so many participants who are attending this webinar organized and hosted by NIT Silchar. I'm glad to see a wonderful team of colleagues at NIT Silchar, and I'm sure your group has a very promising future. All the best. Let me share my screen now.
Yes.
Just a minute. I'll just 1 second.
Yes. Yes.
Do you see my presentation?
Yes,
Yes, sir. It is visible.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So I'll begin. Sorry, ma'am.
That height button is below in the screen. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Just press the height.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Now it is yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So, my presentation title today is Sustainable Transport Measures for Livable Indian Cities. Livability and quality of life has gained very importance and prominence in today's era when we are looking at how cities are degrading in terms of the overall livability and quality of life that we see. Most of the major cities in India are facing huge issues of traffic congestion, the externalities connected to transportation, and so on. So understanding this connection and the causality between the transportation interventions and how it impacts quality of life and livability is something important. And let me throw some of our research on this in this topic and some ideas about it. Mainly, my presentation is derived based on the following two projects. One was an Indo-Norway project called Climatrans, where we focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation policies from transport sector for Indian cities. And the second one was an Indo-UK project called TICTAT, which was towards an integrated global transport and health assessment tool. Both of these projects were quite interdisciplinary in nature, with a interdisciplinary expertise being brought in each of these projects to deal with these complex topics and to understand these connections of transport with health, with climate change impacts and so on. And it was all collaborative research. So Climatrans was primarily a collaboration with Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, along with colleagues in School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, TERI, IIT Bombay. Likewise, the Indo-UK project was a collaboration together with IIT Delhi in India, as well as Cambridge University in UK. So it was a wonderful experience, and I would mainly derive most of my content from these projects. Now, before going to that, it's important to look at what's happening today, what we are experiencing now. So when we look at sustainable urban mobility for more livable Indian cities in post-COVID-19 world, we have already seen the glimpses of how quality of life or livability actually improved during this lockdown period while we are facing this COVID-19 pandemic, where for example, the ambient levels of pollutants have gone down substantially, as you can see. Hopefully, with my let me see if I can have a pointer. Um, yeah, so you can see clearly here, how the PM levels have gone down. How nature was reclaiming its space. Cycling, became a very relevant mode option, considering the social distancing norms and other aspects and so on. But when we look at what would be a post-COVID world in terms of transport system, it's important to also take a recap of what was the pre-COVID-19 world and what situation we were facing, because most of the time our memory is short and we tend to forget what we were experiencing. So clearly, statistics, one can throw statistics, but I think it's very clear and all of us understand that we have seen steady growth in traffic congestion, growth in accidents, the number of accidents as well as fatalities happening due to road accidents. We have also been seeing growing environmental problems, whether it is in terms of degrading air quality or increased noise pollution or climate change impact. And with now more and more vehicle kilometers traveled by motorized modes and road infrastructure being pumped in, we have also seen growing fuel consumption, leading to higher exhaust emissions, causing negative health impacts. And all the sum effect of this we have been seeing in terms of degrading livability of cities. These are all glimpses that have been quite common in the pre-COVID-19 world that we have seen. So we have to keep this aspect in mind, this picture in mind, what we were experiencing in the pre-COVID world when we go towards the post-COVID world. And as I said, the lockdown has shown us how nature was thriving, how nature was reclaiming its space, and we have seen these visuals and news about how the nature has been reclaiming its space. Suddenly a mountain range more than 200 kilometers away becomes visible because the sky is clear due to much lesser pollution. Likewise, the sight of flamingos in Mumbai. Even city like Delhi, which had seen extreme levels of PM, one can see how the site was 1 year before and during this lockdown period. Now the question is, these improvements, this improvement livability that we have seen due to the lockdown situation, will this be a new normal? Of course, we would like this to be a new normal, but will this be a new normal? And if at all, whether it would be temporary or forever, that's a big question at us. Whether these improvements would remain temporary and we'll just wait for things to the corona to go and back to business as usual. So maybe temporarily till our corona uncle is around. These improvements may be visible. You may still have cleaner air, lesser traffic congestion, and so on. But once the corona is gone, everybody gets vaccine, things are back to normal. It's unlikely that this will remain a new normal after that, unless only if we learn lessons clearly, from this pandemic, and think about specific interventions that can be introduced to make it a new normal. So to make this new normal forever, it really requires focus, interventions learned from this pandemic. Otherwise, we are looking or staring at a much worse future. So if you go into post-COVID-19 world and look at business as usual scenario, I would say the business as usual scenario would actually be worse than the pre-COVID world. You would see even higher traffic congestion, mainly because the mode shift that we are seeing towards personal mobility options preferred over sustainable modes because of the risk of virus, because of uh, um, the social distancing norms and so on. There is a growing preference, going towards using personal mobility options. Uh, we are likely to see more road accidents, especially of vulnerable road users. Now, when you have more personal vehicles going onto the road, the conflict situations between vulnerable road users, especially pedestrians and vehicular traffic, are going to increase, and this may lead to more accidents, especially of vulnerable road users. Even higher environmental problem in terms of air quality. There will be more exhaust emissions because the kilometers traveled on motorized vehicles would increase, more engine noise, more carbon emissions, and higher fuel consumption because of higher vehicle kilometers traveled, and more negative health impacts, mainly because of the increase in emissions and the sustained pollution exposure to that. This would anyway, will then lead to a further degradation of quality of life if we just go into post-COVID-19 world with a business as usual mentality, due to the sum effect of all these things. Now, we have understood over time as the transportation discipline has seen the shift from a supply-centric, a supply-focused, or traditional engineering-focused interventions to more demand-oriented or demand management-based, interventions. We have clearly understood that traditional approach of transportation planning, which was always focused on V by C ratio, is no more resulting in sustainable transport system. So transportation planning should no more be just about removing the congestion points, taking this bottom-up approach and reducing V by C ratio, but should also be about reducing the total vehicle kilometers traveled by all motorized modes and thereby reduce the dependence on fossil fuel. So it basically says a fine combination of both bottom-up and top-down approach as the best way to move forward in terms of transportation planning, which would then lead to sustainable transport system. Eventually, of course, these interventions should lead to more livable Indian cities. Any intervention that makes or that degrades the livability of cities, there's no fun in doing such interventions. So one has to be very clear and understand the clear linkage or clear causality between the transport interventions and the impact on livability and quality of life, so that our interventions doesn't lead to degradation of these important aspects. Now, achieving this was comparatively easier in a pre-COVID-19 world, but would be more difficult and challenging in the post-COVID-19 world. And of course, it would be impossible under a BAU scenario that we talked about. Now I'll come to this Climatron study a little later in the subsequent slide, but just want to drive this point here that if not BAU in post-COVID-19 world, if you look at a sustainable urban mobility scenario, we have to think about a combination of bundles like this, or bundles of interventions. It's very clear that there is no single bullet. There is no single bullet to solve all problems of transportation systems and its connected externalities. You have to have a bundle of measures which helps us achieve the right push and pull effect and right balance effect to so that it brings us sustainable solutions or sustainable scenario. And these bundles should be a good combination of planning, regulatory, and economic instruments. So you can see here, for example, here we are talking about not just planning interventions like increasing network coverage of public transport or increasing walking and cycling infrastructure, or looking at land use, mixed land use measures. But we are also talking about defining car restricted roads, congestion pricing, park and ride, carpooling and high occupancy lanes, and also electrification of buses and cars. So a fine combination of these interventions is the best way to achieve a best possible scenario of urban mobility. Of course, what we should do is top up these interventions with policies learned specifically from pandemic, so that we further improve the effectiveness of these bundles. Now, to sum up what we understand from the sustainable urban mobility scenario, I would try to highlight the core principles that we should think about and follow. And my rest of the presentation would more or less try to give a flavor of how these core principles can be the focus of transport planning and can be achieved. And I'm laying down these 9 core principles. First is reduce the need to travel. I think this is very important, something very well understood during this pandemic time. The fact that this whole webinar is being arranged online clearly shows the amount of travel that all of us could reduce. Experts traveling, attendees traveling and meeting at one place and so on. And likewise, in a normal urban commuting situations, a lot of trips can be reduced by reducing the need to travel itself. So we have seen how work from home has been proved to be effective. So working from home on some days, things like staggered and flexible work hours, study from home, online shopping and home delivery and things like that. These are some of the measures that we have learned how effective they can be in creating a more sustainable situation. Second is reducing the distances for travel. So in an urban context, it's about talking about mixed land use policy and planning. The whole concept or the vision of vocal for local that our Honorable Prime Minister gave, if we actually think it in terms of these transport interventions, it's all about why there is a need for people to travel length and breadth of a city for their daily commuting and daily needs. Why can't it be self-sufficient within a given locality and neighborhood in close distances, so that when you have closer distances, the place where you live and the place where you work or go for education, it's easy for one to adopt these sustainable modes for traveling. Likewise, if you think about this vocal for local at the national level, we see so much of migration happening across the country for better economic opportunities, for education opportunities, and so on. People travel length and breadth. And being a culturally vibrant country with a lot of diversity, there are also number of calendar events around the year for which people keep traveling, whether it is for I'm sorry. Whether it is for festivals or for social functions and so on and so forth. So creating self-contained regions across the country, for example, having equally good institutions in every part of the region, would then not make students, for example, travel from one part of the country to the other part of the country. So reducing the distances for travel can be a very good way in achieving a permanent sustainability in transportation systems. So that's the second core principle that we can talk about. Ensure equal access to all. It's extremely important. I think equity has never been the core focus and principle of transportation planning, but we have to make it now, across gender, across income groups, differently abled, and so on. Fourth core principle could be infuse more infrastructure for sustainable modes. We still don't have a saturated infrastructure. When we think about adding more infrastructure, it's important to infuse more infrastructure for sustainable modes so that they become more attractive options. For example, priority lanes for sustainable modes, whether it is bus lanes or cycle lanes, better quality footpaths, more network for mass rapid transit systems, increasing the fleet size of these public transport modes, and so on and so forth. Fifth core principle is assign correct priority of movement and right-of-way allocation. Really going from NMT to public transport and then personal mobility, following that reverse pyramid, in terms of who gets better priority in terms of interventions, and accordingly imagine the right-of-way allocation. Today, we have a very flawed notion of right-of-way allocation where we keep maximizing the road space allocation for personal mobility modes. Sixth principle is ensure seamless, contactless, and safe travel experience with sustainable modes and incentivize its higher usage. Contactless travel has become a requirement to take care of the COVID risk and so on. But we have always talked about seamlessness, seamlessness of travel across different public transport modes when you're moving from point A to point B in a city or a location. So ensuring that, and also incentivizing the higher usage. It's like, the flying returns. You fly more, you get points, you can redeem them and so on, or like credit card usage, where you spend more and you get points, you can redeem them and so on. Why not incentivize the mileages traveled on the sustainable modes in some way or the other? Seventh principle, discourage all types of high polluting and high space occupying vehicles per unit of person carried. I think it makes it very clear. So things like congestion charging, odd even rule, or parking policy, pedestrianizing busy streets and areas, and so on, are some of the policies that one can think about. Promoting cleaner vehicle technology and fuel for all vehicle categories. So going towards renewable fuels as well as clean fuels and cleaner vehicle technology is important. For example, this whole thrust on electric vehicles, and with a renewable source and a clean source, it can really go a long way in achieving certain at least certain principles of sustainable mobility. And ninth, last but not the least, improving the disaster resiliency of transportation system. Again, disaster resiliency is something we have never seen as the core focus or principle in transport planning, but we have to make it now. Okay. So I think these 9 core principles are something that one should keep in mind going into post-COVID-19 world as the best way to achieve a sustainable mobility scenario. And of course, our cities have done enough experiments with this business of flyovers and elevated corridors. And we have seen time and again that these are, the same traditional engineering based measure, V by C focused measures, which only leads to more vehicle kilometers traveled and more externalities of transport system. And, further increases the induced demand and make the congestion come back in no time. So it will be a pity, from this pandemic that we have seen how things have improved and what modes are relevant if you don't learn our lessons even from such a pandemic. Cycling, of course, fits very well under this COVID scenario. It takes care of both social distancing and sustainable mobility, and which can be easily affordable to all sections of the society. It's not a costly mode that a large section of society cannot afford. But what needs to be done? We need policies to increase the mode share of cycling. We need, citywide network of safe cycling infrastructure. Rejuvenate the bicycle sharing systems. Most of the bicycle sharing systems which popped up in last few years are now dying because of the lack of policies, lack of infrastructure, and so on. So we get to rejuvenate them so that there is good supply of cycling, as a mode. Need innovations to make cycling a mode for all purpose, age groups and gender, and longer distances, making it weather resistant and safe. I think there's a lot in this bullet point that one can do. For example, today, if you think about cycling as a mode for all purposes, it's just not possible. If you want to go for shopping, can you carry shopping bags on cycle? No. The kind of cycles that we have today, we can't. But for example, if you see something here, there's a lot of innovations being done in Scandinavian countries and some of the European countries where cycling is carries the major mode share, like Amsterdam, Copenhagen, other cities, where they've done a lot of innovations in terms of cycling design and other aspects to make it an all-purpose vehicle, all age group, gender, and so on and so forth. Better integration with public transport can help the distance range for which people can use cycle, and integration with other, micro mobility options can also be a good way in overall promoting these measures. Of course, to execute all these things and focus on those core principles, we need a good integration across different government agencies and levels of governance. Okay. So this whole idea of unified transport bodies in cities, something that we have talked about for long in terms of UMTA, it has to now become a reality. If not, this is the best time and the most important time when it is needed more than ever. Let me quickly come back to the some of the results of climate trans. Where we focused on the climate change mitigation policies from transport sector for Indian cities. These were the core objectives of this project, although I'll not go into details of all these aspects, but would focus only on one of the aspects, which is mitigation. We were looking at, the horizon year of 2030 and 2050 to develop mitigation strategies from urban transport. There were 3 case studies that were taken: Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore. I'll only focus and present on Bangalore case study because that was something that we were handling ourselves. Second was to identify the vulnerability of transport infrastructure to climate change impact. And then based on that, develop the adaptation strategies also for horizon year 2030 and 2050, considering this vulnerability. And here we had actually focused on urban flooding as one of the case, as one of the examples of climate change impact. Okay, so how one can make transportation system in urban areas more resilient to urban flooding through different kinds of bundles of interventions and measures, and how that can be evaluated. In this presentation, in the interest of the time, I'll not touch upon the adaptation part. Hopefully next time when I'll have opportunity, I'll separately present this whole work on the adaptation that we have done. But in this presentation for rest, I'll focus on the mitigation aspect, mainly focusing on improving the overall livability of the case city Bangalore. Now hello.
Yes, sir, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Can you have a look in the message in the chat box of the Google Meet?
Okay.
Just for.
Sorry. Is there a message for me?
Yes, I just.
Okay. So I've got more time. That's great.
Yes.
Yes. Thanks.
Thank you.
So yeah, but only thing is, in between, maybe sometime after say 15 minutes, we can take a couple of minutes break. Is that fine?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. For it.
Yeah. So I'll continue.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.
You can see the screen now with the slide.
Yes, sir. Now it is visible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So when you talk about livability, livability is the sum of factors that add up to a community's quality of life, including the built and natural environment, economic prosperity, social stability and equity, educational opportunities, and cultural entertainment and recreational possibilities. It's basically, whether, for example, residents feeling, safe, socially connected, included, how well we are able to achieve environmental sustainability, how well we are able to afford access to affordable and diverse housing options, education and other things. So basically, they are needed to promote health and well-being in individuals, build communities, and support a sustainable society. When you look at, we did a lot of literature review and understanding what kind of quality of life indicators one can think about, especially based on the urban transport sector. And if we categorize them in the 3 pillars that we typically talk about, economic, environment, and social, these are the kind of indicators that one can see. For example, under social, one can think about health, equity, safety, freedom, education, access to education, people's own identity, privacy, social relations, etc., as some of the indicators. Likewise, in environment, in terms of protecting environment, hazardous material, traffic fatalities, likewise energy consumption and so on. So there are a number of indicators that one can think about for quality of life. Some of them can be quantitative, some of them can be qualitative, not so easy to measure. But we really need more research in this direction to understand how one can evaluate transportation systems and transportation sector in terms of quality of life and livability. We have done some research, but of course, a lot more has to happen for Indian cities. In this Climatron study, we mainly focused on the quantitative evaluation of livability, and we focused on all these uh, uh, um, indicators. One is reduced traffic congestion in terms of reducing the vehicle kilometers traveled by all motorized mode. Second was reduced exhaust emissions, and we focused on PM, CO, NOx, hydrocarbon, and CO2 as reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Then we also focused on reducing the carbon emission intensity with respect to GDP growth. Now, why we took this? Because if you recall, in the in the climate summit in Paris in 2015, government of India actually abided by certain INDCs, and these INDCs nothing but intended nationally determined contribution. And India committed that by 2030, the country would reduce its carbon emission intensity with respect to GDP by about 30 to 33% with respect to the base level of 2005. Okay, so we also thought it's prudent to see whether the sustainable transport interventions one is thinking about in urban transport, can they help us achieve at least the target that government has committed as part of the INDCs. Likewise, we also focused on the economic gains in terms of consumer surplus. So in future, when you introduce these bundles of measures, whether who and which modes gain economically and which modes gain lose economically. And last, the improved resiliency of transport systems. So these are our quantitative indicators to evaluate livability. I'll not focus much on this slide, but the main idea, important point to take from here is that when we look at the pre-COVID era, we can clearly say that our Indian cities were trapped in a vicious circle of congestion, which actually started from this whole aspect of economic growth in early 1990s and increased car ownership, the exponential growth in car ownership. Since then, leading to the transport network suddenly being found inadequate and leading to more congestion and delay. So families who aspire to own and use a car suddenly find it difficult to enjoy that. And with that, we start this vicious circle of congestion where people put public pressure on their public representatives, policymakers, bureaucrats to increase more road capacity, so that everybody can enjoy their aspiration of car ownership and usage. And the result is we keep seeing more road widenings, flyover, underpasses, and so on, which makes the movement by personal vehicles easy, especially cars being a devil. And this then further leads to more urban sprawl, cities being horizontally growing, which then do nothing but increase the number of trips as well as the average length of trips, and brings us back to more congestion and delay. So our cities had been trapped in this vicious circle of congestion. And clearly, we understand there are various ways to cut this vicious circle of congestion. At the beginning itself, when you see that the societies become wealthier, you bring in policies to discourage car ownership. Or when you see that car ownership is already high, and you also want to deter the car usage, we should bring in policies to discourage car usage. Um, um, when we have more congestion and delay, and there is a need to infuse more infrastructure, that should be focused on increasing the infrastructure for sustainable transport modes, giving priority to these sustainable modes, mixed land use strategies to regulate urban sprawl and things like that. So these are some of the ways in which we can cut across this vicious circle of congestion, and which is what we have tried attempting to evaluate in this project of Climatrans. And clearly, from our national urban transport policy that keeps, its focus on moving people and not vehicles, and that's how we have to think about the sustainable transport interventions. Now, we also need to keep in mind the existing state of transport system in our country and how it compares to some of the rich economies, for example, US, Australia, Japan, Germany, etc. And when you club India along with the BRIC countries. Now, clearly, we have seen when you look at this graph between the GDP per capita on x-axis and cars owned per thousand population on y-axis, the historical trend clearly says a S-shaped curve, where the middle portion, which is a steep portion of the curve, is typically between 5,000 to 20,000 GDP per capita in US dollars, where these countries, rich economies, which have already saturated in terms of their cars per thousand population, somewhere in the range of 600 to 800 cars per thousand population, they have seen a steep growth in their car ownership during this middle phase. Now, clearly, BRIC countries are at the early stage, and India is only at the doorstep of this steep growth curve. So, what it's clearly, is clear from this graph is that we have both opportunity as well as challenge. Okay, so the point is, can we show a different curve? Now, of course, India is an aspiring economy, and we would like to grow economically. So it's not that we would like to restrict our growth on the x-axis. We would like to grow economically. We would like to increase our GDP. But while doing so, can our curve for car ownership can be different? Can we saturate at a much lower level than the developed economies? Okay, that's where we say there is both an opportunity and challenge. Opportunity because our current levels of car ownership are already less, and we only need to restrict it rather than going very high like these saturated economies and then trying to trace back and come back. The challenge is when other countries have seen this kind of trend, how to make it different for India. That's where it's challenge. That you grow economically, but decouple the car ownership growth with the economic growth. Okay, so we have to keep this in mind when we think about the future in the Indian context. Clearly, what we are seeing is with this current trend of car ownership. For example, here you can see Bangalore has been seeing doubling its car ownership rate every 5 years. So that's the level of increase. We are registering about almost 1,500 to 2,000 new cars every day in the Bangalore city, and situation is not very different in other cities. Likewise, when you think about the infusion of MRTS, so here these are normalized values of the length of MRTS routes, which are on exclusive right of way per thousand population. You would see that these values are much lesser than some of the more developed MRTS systems like in Berlin or Tokyo. Okay, so our infusion of the MRTS systems in Indian cities is also at an nascent level, which means that we still don't have that level of supply of good public transport system which runs an exclusive right of way so that it becomes an attractive option. And clearly one can see here in this table that when you are comparing the vehicle kilometers and passenger kilometers traveled, where vehicle kilometers mainly represents the supply and passenger kilometer travel mainly represents the demand, both in terms of number of trips as well as the length of the trip. One can clearly see that, for example, in case of Delhi, while bus has much higher supply as compared to metro, in terms of usage, it is much higher for metro as compared to buses. This clearly brings out the point that when you supply a public transport system which runs on a right of way A with exclusive right of way, people tend to use it more and for longer distances. Our per capita emissions also presently are quite less when you compare, many other countries. This is again something that shows that we still have an advantage and an opportunity to contain them and not grow and allow them to grow to a larger extent or larger level. So from these few statistics that I gave, the main takeaway what we can see is there is a clear opportunity for developing economies to make a choice and leapfrog to a sustainable transport future, mainly because our road infrastructure is still at a lower level while we are growing it at fast rate. Our public transport and NMT infrastructure is also at a nascent level, so we clearly have a good choice available to us, that when we are building more infrastructure, which infrastructure we build more. Likewise, trip lengths in many Indian cities are still lesser and conducive for using sustainable modes. So a right set of policy planning and infrastructure interventions can help us achieve a sustainable mobility future quite easily. Yeah. So when we think about transport interventions and think about reviewing the transport interventions, one should always ask questions like these. What is the amount of person capacity added per unit of investment made? Mainly because our focus is on moving people, not vehicles. What is the amount of person capacity being added per unit of extra space width that you're creating? You may widen a road, but you allow it for personal mobility modes, then you are actually underutilizing that extra space being created, rather than compared to that, it keeping it aside for bus lane or for cycle lane or for footpath. But by what amount the fossil fuel consumption will change because of the proposed interventions, and how the air and noise pollution will change. If somebody does a thorough investigation to answer these questions for any transport improvements or proposals being made anytime in a city by city authorities, we would always ensure that our interventions are sustainable in nature. So while today the traffic engineers see the vision of the transport planning like this, where car takes or personal mobility option takes a central stage, we should actually look at like this, in terms of how we can create a more sustainable transport system. Now, coming back to the flowchart of the mitigation and adaptation under this climate trans project, what we do is we first set up the base year emissions and also the future year emissions and targets based on the inputs of socioeconomic trends, transportation trends, and so on. In terms of scenario analysis, on one side we focused on the mitigation, where we estimate the mode-wise emissions and then design mitigation policies and evaluate these mitigation policies using a methodology based on macro simulation models, the travel demand models that we adopted. On the other side, we also looked at adaptation, where we take flood maps for a given city as an input and carry out the vulnerability analysis of the road network in terms of flooded links and how it impacts transport system, and then design adaptation policies and evaluate them. So that was the overall methodology that we had. As I said, I'll further, I would focus only on the mitigation aspect. This is the detailed methodology for developing the mitigation strategies. So with setting up the baseline trends and target levels, in terms of scenario formulation, we have on one side the BAU scenario and other side the sustainable transport scenarios, which we actually create through a Delphi approach and create different possible bundles of sustainable transport measures that we evaluate or analyze and compare it with BAU, using a travel demand modeling framework, which helps us estimate not just the travel demand in different scenarios, but also estimate the mode-wise emissions, the emission intensity, and also the consumer surplus, which together helps us do the appraisal of different strategies compared to BAU and help us develop a good mitigation plan so as to improve the livability of the city. Going further, so when we tried forecasting the BAU scenario for 2030 and 2050, this is how the mode share actually looks like in the base year, as well as in 2030 and 2050. In the BAU scenario, you would see that the car mode share, which is 2.3 in the base year. Now, just to keep in mind that the study area of the focus was the whole Bangalore metropolitan region. which actually consists of 3 districts: Bangalore urban, Bangalore rural, and Ramnagar. And the total area is about more than 8,000 square kilometers. So when we look at the car, mode share, it is increasing in the BAU scenario. At the same time, since the metro has been infused from after the base year, there is a slight increase in the public transport share also, together with metro and bus. But you clearly see an increase in the car mode share also, because a lot of projects and a lot of interventions are still road-based and traditional infrastructure-based measures. Now, when we translate this change in mode share in terms of VKT, vehicle kilometers traveled, one would clearly see from these, loaded network, how the links get darker in 2030 and 2050 for the public transport flows and private, personal modes flows. And when you look at the total vehicle kilometers traveled by all motorized mode, one can clearly see, as compared to base year, by 2030, one would see an increase of 55% in the VKT, and by 2050, an increase in 132% by 2050 as compared to BAU. That's the expected increase in the total vehicle kilometers traveled by motorized mode under the BAU scenario. Now, if you translate this into how the emissions would change, one can clearly see when we focus on these pollutants as compared to base year, you would see, for example, the CO2 emissions would increase by more than 2,000%, the PM 2.5 more than 100%, NOx 300%, and so on. So this is the expected change in the pollutant levels in the BAU scenario in 2030 and 2050. Clearly, if you see this in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of better livability, the BAU scenario clearly says that neither the traffic congestion would reduce because the VKT is increasing, nor the emissions would reduce, because we are only seeing a huge increase in the emissions. So the BAU scenario is certainly not sustainable. So something has to be done to make it sustainable, and that's where the alternate scenarios come in picture, which we call it as sustainable transport scenarios. And what we have done further is how we can create these sustainable transport scenarios and evaluate them. Ambika, can we take a few minutes, 5 minutes break now?
Yes, sir. As you wish.
We'll start at 12 again. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
No, it's sorry.
11.
So at 11. Yeah.
Sure, sir. So
I'll
for the
just
participants, yes, sir. This is small announcements for the participants that our second speaker is unfortunately not with us actually. So Ashish Brahma sir will continue for another session. So please bear with us. Okay. Thank you.
Ambika, can we start again?
Yes, sir. Just 1 minute.
Okay, we'll just
Yes.
let me know. Let me know
Yes,
once.
sir. No. But you have started, no? Sir. Hello, sir. Ashish, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, live is already started, so you can continue, sir.
Okay, I can continue. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
You just present your slide. Yes.
Yeah, it's there.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Please
Yeah.
continue, sir.
Thank you. You can ask the other attendees to mute. The mic. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sure.
So going further now, we'll see how we develop the sustainable transport scenarios, and then how we evaluated them. So of course we started first with from the literature and different case studies across the world, and in the scientific literature we tried to first list out what are the possible interventions that one can think about on all dimensions. For example, planning related interventions when we're talking about increasing network coverage of public transport, or land use policies, or walking and cycling infrastructure and things like that. Then things that one can do in regulatory and economic instruments, for example, increase in fuel cost, or improving the vehicle inspection and vehicle standards, and so on. Information related interventions, and even technology related interventions, like for example low emission vehicles, electric vehicles, and so on. So we started first with an exhaustive list of these different types of or kinds of interventions that one can think about. And then the whole idea was that can we create a good mix of some interventions from few or each of these instruments, as creating these bundles, okay, and see whether these bundles make sense and can we evaluate them as sustainable transport scenarios. Now, of course, while creating these bundles, the focus is on whether we can achieve that right push and pull concept. We generally talk in the transportation planning aspect, where clearly there are certain modes that we want to discourage people to use, and there are certain modes that we want to encourage. And so we want to ensure that whether these bundles of sustainable transport scenario would help us achieve that right push and pull effect or not. And the second concept was, or the second focus while creating these bundles, was to ensure that a city like Bangalore, which was our case study, whether it comes out of this vicious circle of congestion or not, that we talked about in a few slides back. So achieving this right push and pull concept, and helping the city to come out of the vicious circle of congestion. So going through a Delphi approach, where we actually had multiple rounds of meetings and feedback from the stakeholders in the city. In fact, stakeholders from all agencies like the public transport bus company, BMTC in Bangalore, the Development Authority, Corporation Pollution Control Board, and so on and so forth. So taking officials and representatives, even from citizens, groups and so on, we basically throughout the first round of bundles to the stakeholders, ask them to evaluate and weigh one over each other and so on. And through a good iteration, we eventually came out with these 4 possible different kinds of bundles with different flavors in each of the bundles as possible sustainable transport scenarios for further evaluation. So if you see, for example, bundle 1 is primarily a combination of planning and regulatory instrument, where while we are focusing on increasing the network coverage of public transport, and improving the cycling and walk infrastructure. We are also talking about additional tax on purchasing vehicle as a regulatory instrument. Second bundle is more focused on economic and regulatory instruments, where we are having additional tax on purchasing vehicles. At the same time, we are focusing on improving the emission standard of vehicles and increasing the fuel cost. Third bundle is more comprehensive, with combination of these planning, regulatory and economic instruments, the network coverage of public transport, cycling and walking infrastructure, but then we are also including defining car restricted roads, congestion pricing, park and ride, carpooling and high occupancy lanes, encouraging them, and mixed land use policies. The fourth bundle, we added the technology instrument also by adding this intervention of all buses and cars running on electricity. So along with all the measures listed in bundle 3 and adding another one of technology instrument. So what we did was, this was the outcome of the Delphi approach, and then we went further and started evaluating them. Now, of course, to evaluate them, we have to have an implementation plan. For the city Bangalore, for each of these listed interventions that we are talking here, like here, increasing network coverage of public transport, we identified or created an implementation plan for each of these interventions, like which and how many links we are now adding to increase the public transport coverage. Besides, for example, the existing bus route network that is already existing, and the existing and future plans of metro rail expansion. So identifying congested links, adding more public transport links, and remodeling the travel times and so on. So when you implement such a intervention, it essentially would impact the modeling variables, including travel cost, the in-vehicle and out-vehicle travel time, and so on. That's how the modeling system gets sensitive to the implementation of such interventions. Likewise, for example, defining car restricted roads. So we identified heavily congested and more pedestrianized, links where there is also more pedestrian movement. And these, for example, are the list of roads that we identified, where we define them as car restricted roads. And of course, the model parameters that it may impact would be these, and that's how we take into account the impact of this intervention on how the travel flow and travel demand would change. Likewise, encouraging carpooling and high occupancy lanes. So this combination of arterial and subarterial network were identified to implement high occupancy lanes with carpooling, vehicles and other bus lanes being implemented on these HOV lanes, and then fed them into the model system. So likewise, we created an implementation plan for each and every listed intervention that we had in the bundles. And then we move further to analyze these bundles, 4 bundles of sustainable transport measures with the implementation plan of each of these measures. Now, when you look at the impact on mode share, which is where we are looking at this push and pull effect, whether we are getting the right push and pull effect or not. So here we are looking at the evaluation of bundle 1, where we had these 3, interventions that we had included, and we have the mode share of 2030 and mode share of 2050. And you'll see there are 2 bars for each of the mode. One is for BAU and other is for the bundle 1 scenario. And you would see that we are able to increase the mode share of bus and metro to some extent, and also walking and cycling. Car mode share goes down a bit, and also of 2-wheeler and 3-wheeled auto rickshaws. And similar trend is observed in 2050 also. So clearly it helps us see that we are able to achieve a right push and pull effect due to the introduction of bundle 1. The question is, which bundle gives us the maximum push and pull effect in the desired direction that we are intending to achieve. So we had similar results in bundle 2, but what we got was the maximum impact in bundle 3. Now bundle 4 only has an additional intervention of all buses and cars running on electricity, and we neglected its impact on the change in mode share. So what we are seeing here is also applicable to bundle 4, with the assumption that there's no change in the mode share due to introduction of electric buses and cars. So here we see that the car mode share, for example, in 2050 comes down from 5.1 to 1.8. The mode share of public transport, buses and metro together is reaching 65 to 70%, and the mode share of cycling and walking is reaching about 25%. So altogether, taking care of public transport and NMT, we are able to achieve a mode share of anywhere between 80 to 90%, which is what the kind of desired, modes share or mode split balance that we would like to have a more sustainable state of the transportation system. Now, when we see this in terms of how the VKT is changing, and again, you have two graphs here, 2030 and 2050. This bar is for BAU, and then we have 3 bars for bundle 1, 2, and 3. So the maximum savings in VKT are obtained for the bundle 3 scenario, about 4.7, 3.2% reduction. Now, this may look small, but we have to keep in mind that we are focusing on the future scenario where the population growth is already happening. In fact, the projected population for Bangalore for 2030 is close to 2 crores, and for 2050 it's beyond 3 crores. So, and we have taken them as given as an external factor in the model, affecting the trip generation and changing the total amount of trips being produced. So clearly there are more trips being produced due to the huge expected increase in population. But in spite of all that, we are still able to achieve certain savings in VKT by all motorized mode. Now, this is primarily happening also because if you see this in together with the push and pull effect, the mode share change, you can see that even when there is higher number of trips, the balance of trips and how they are being carried is resulting in a net savings in VKT. Now, let's see how this translates into the change in the emissions. Now, to estimate the emissions, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we focused on these 5 main pollutants: carbon monoxide, NOx, CO, hydrocarbon, and PM. And in PM, we focused on PM 2.5. Now, the point is that it would be a misleading, argument if of promoting electric vehicles if we don't take into account the source of electricity production, whether it is coming through renewable and non-renewable sources. And presently, if you see the situation in India, most of the grid, electricity or power is coming from coal-based electricity, which is a non-renewable source with a very heavy emissions. So while the emissions are not happening at the consumption point, they are certainly happening somewhere else at the production point. Okay, so it's still being contributed to transport system. So one has to also see how is the share of renewable and non-renewable going in future, and how well we can go towards renewable sources, and how then that would have impact on the actual emissions, taking into account the source of electricity production. So in India, the typical non-renewable sources are coal, heavy fuel oil, natural gas, and nuclear, and renewable sources are typically hydropower, bioenergy, solar, waste, and wind. And it's important to understand that even among renewable sources, not all the sources are clean. For example, from bioenergy, you still have higher levels of PM and few other pollutants, while CO2 is zero. Whereas the sources like solar or wind or probably hydropower are completely clean. So even among renewable sources, how much you're able to push towards a completely clean source of energy is important to ensure that the electric vehicles are zero, polluting vehicles in a true sense. So what we did was, since we still don't have a clear picture of what would be the share of renewable and non-renewable sources of electricity, we took 4 different scenarios of the share of renewable and non-renewable with 2 extremes. Scenario 2 being 100% non-renewable, and scenario 4 being 100% renewable. Okay, and then scenario 1 with 74 to 26% share, 26 being the renewable, and scenario 3 of 50-50 share. So we took these 4 different scenarios of electricity production together with the 4 different bundles of sustainable transport policy. So we had a 4 by 4, a 16 cell matrix for us to evaluate. Now, taking these scenarios into account, our collaborator, Professor Munish Chandel at CSE in IIT Bombay, he did a good research to estimate and arrive at the emission factors for different vehicles, conventional as well as electric, and for different years, taking into account several factors: the share of renewable and non-renewable, change in the emission standards, vehicle technology, and other factors. See, we have to keep in mind that today's emission factors cannot be simply used for estimating the future exhaust emissions, because the scenarios would be different. So this is a good piece of research where the emission factors have been forecasted in gram per kilometers for the future years as well, take into account all these factors. And you can see here, this is the scenario 4 of electric vehicles, where the 100% electricity is coming from renewable sources. And you will see, for example, the future CO2 emissions become 0, but you still have emissions of PM and NOx. That clearly shows, and to some extent CO also. So that clearly shows that in the renewable sources also, since you don't have completely clean source of energy, you still have emissions from the for some of the pollutants. So likewise, we obtained the emission factors for electric vehicles for all 4 scenarios. Now, the way, of course, we estimate the total exhaust emissions from all motorized modes is by factoring the VKT by mode-wise with the emission factors for those individual modes to arrive at the emissions. And let me take you through a few of the results of these emissions being estimated. And you can clearly see now in these bars, there are 17 bars. 16 is for the combination of bundle as well as the electricity production scenario, like B1, S1, B1, S2, and so on. Say, for example, B4, S4 is bundle 4 of sustainable transport scenario, together with S4, which is the 100% electricity being produced from renewable sources. And the last bar, the 17th bar, is the BAU. Okay. Now the top figure is the total emissions, and here we are talking about carbon monoxide in tons per year for 2030, and the lower figure is for per capita carbon monoxide emissions in per person per year for 2030. So one can see that in the best case possible, which is the B4S4 combination, we're able to achieve about a 65% mitigation potential of carbon monoxide in total emissions, and about 25% in per capita carbon monoxide emissions. And what we also did additionally was that even within this S4, which is 100% renewable, if you make it completely clean source, excluding bioenergy, your potential reduction would increase to 73% in total and about 26% in per capita. Likewise, this is the 2050 estimate for the same carbon monoxide emissions total and per capita. Then if you look at CO2, one can clearly see that with this best scenario, bundle 4 S4, as compared to BAU, one can achieve a 98% mitigation potential. A 98% mitigation potential of carbon emission reduction, and about 56% in per capita. So that's a huge potential of mitigation potential that we can have with the introduction of this scenario, where you have policies of bundle 4 together with 100% electricity being produced from renewable. Okay. And this is for 2050 for CO2. Then we have PM. particulate matter PM2.5 for 2030 total and per capita, and you can see a 72% mitigation potential for this bundle 4 S4 scenario compared to BAU, and about 5% in per capita. If you actually clean the source of electricity in this S4, this potential reaches to 97% in total and 15% in per capita. So if you completely clean the source of renewables energy as well. Likewise, this is for 2050 for PM2.5. So if in nutshell, if you summarize the maximum mitigation potential for under this B4 S4 scenario as compared to BAU, this is the percentage of mitigation potential for each of these pollutants that one can achieve. And these are huge amount of savings clearly. And if you see the reduction in the VKT plus the amount of reduction that we can achieve on each of these pollutants, one can clearly see that you can make the city much more livable in terms of these quantitative indicators that we are talking about. We further went, as I said, and compared the impact of these bundles also in terms of the emission intensity with respect to GDP. And I was mentioning during the introduction that India actually had committed for reducing its emission intensity with respect to GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level. Okay, so what we did was we tried to estimate the emission intensity achieved or reduction in the emission intensity achieved for each of these bundle of scenarios and see whether same 33 to 25% reduction can be achieved at least from the urban transport sector or not. And what you can clearly see here is, for example, in this lower figure, with the B4 S4 scenario, the mitigation potential with respect to the base level of 2005-8 is 91%. So clearly, it is more than 3 times of what India actually committed in the climate summit. So we can actually outperform our commitments to the international community if we are able to introduce a combination of this, bundle 4 and then S4. What we also did was, if we clean up the electricity source completely, we also found out that even with the BAU scenario, one can achieve a 39% reduction in the CO2 emissions by 2030, even with BAU scenario, by just cleaning up the source of electricity. In the BAU scenario, actually, the emission intensity is still quite high, mainly because a lot more trips are happening on metro rail systems, for example, which are running on electricity, or a certain share of buses running on electricity, which would lead to much higher amount of emissions when we account for the production of electricity. So if we clean that source, even with BAU, we are able to achieve a 39% reduction. Now, I'll take, I think, 10 minutes more and finish the rest of the part, so that we'll have some time for the question answer also, 10 to 15 minutes maximum. I'll come to this other part of, the work as part of this Indo-UK project, where we were assessing the health impacts of transportation. And here our methodology was to look at 3 different pathways of health impact that we focused on. One was the impact of using active modes of transport, which is walking and cycling. So how the physically active modes have an impact on health. The second was the air pollution, the exposure to air pollution, and what is the health impact on that. And here we mainly focused on the exposure to PM2.5 and how that is, resulting in the mortalities and so on. And third pathway of health impact was the injury model, where we are focusing on the impact on the road traffic fatalities from the transport system. So we took these 3 pathways to understand the health impact in totality. To some extent, some of these are still work in progress. I'll only show some of the concepts and few results from whatever we have so far. Of course, when we think about the exposure to pollution, I always say, it's like a slow poison because the effects are not observed immediately. This whole exposure to pollutants, we keep inhaling them. It's not that we'll immediately have its impact visible to us. So it's not observed immediately. However, we keep getting exposed to these pollutants over a sustained period of time, and it reaches to a point where it actually hits our health, and that would be a point or a situation where we'll already be at the point of no return. So it's like a slow poison. It keeps poisoning you at a slow rate without we being realizing, and only realizing at a point when we are at the point of no return. And so it's important to understand this causality and take care of it to whatever extent possible. One of the important aspects that we need to do to understand this exposure level is, from the Climatron study, we have already created a methodology to estimate the total exhaust emissions coming from all motorized vehicles. But we got to connect this to the ambient levels or the exposure levels of these pollutants. What is the exposure level to pedestrians? What is the exposure level to a commuter sitting in a public transport vehicle or inside a car, and so on and so forth? For this, we need two things. If we really have to do a good, modeling exercise, one is the source apportionment, so that the ambient level of these pollutants are apportioned to the different sources, to what extent different sources, including transportation, is contributing to the ambient level. So while we may have estimate of the exhaust emissions, it is still not sufficient for us to understand the exposure level, because we have still not connected it to the ambient levels. So for example, when we have sensors in different parts of the city, they basically measure the ambient levels. So we got to do a good source apportionment study in any given city to connect to the sectoral emissions and how much contribution each sector is giving. Once we do that, and once we have these ambient levels at certain discrete points in the city through these sensors, we also need to do a good air dispersion modeling to then estimate the emission levels in a grid or in a continuum space over the study area, to understand the exposure level at any given point or at any given level. So to reach up to the actual health impact, we have to connect these dots of doing a good source apportionment study and air dispersion model. And this is something that we are presently doing with our collaborators. For the city of Bangalore, for example, they have tried estimating the grid-wise emissions of transportation. And the estimated PM10 emissions load from transport sector are about 6,400 to 9,000 tons per year, and this is how the spread of these emissions are in the city, in the grid pattern. As I said, there's still a work in progress, and hopefully we'll have more results in future. The other pathway, as I mentioned, was the road user risk, and what we did was we actually collected the total fatality, all the FIRs of road accidents from our State Crime Record Bureau for several years, starting from 2011 up to 2016-17, of all the FIRs. And what we did was we extracted all the information related to all the fatalities where the death has happened in each given year, and the corresponding data that was available to us. And what the first thing we have tried doing is developing this kind of who hit whom matrix, which basically categorizes the culprit vehicle and the which is like the offending vehicle and the victim vehicle or the mode user. So to explain it better, if you see, for example, the the pedestrian as For example, let me see. Yeah, it's the pedestrian. So sorry, this is the victim, and these are the offenders. So if you see pedestrian as a victim, the maximum deaths to pedestrians are happening due to car, due to sorry two-wheelers, and then car jeep, and then the heavy vehicles. Okay, and these are the total deaths of pedestrians. So if you look at these totals, one can clearly then see which are the vulnerable road users, and clearly one can see pedestrians and two-wheelers. Two-wheelerists are the vulnerable road users with a higher, much higher share of deaths in the total data. Likewise, so the same data is shown in terms of these bars, and you can see these are the offender vehicles, and you will see two-wheeler is quite a high offending vehicle for pedestrian deaths, followed by a car, and then the buses and so on. Likewise, if we see the buses, it's causing more deaths for two-wheelerists, and these heavy vehicles and so on. Likewise, we actually created this who hit who matrix for different years, 2011, 12, 13, and so on. And then what we did was we tried developing this kind of risk-based model to estimate the fatalities of a certain victim type with respect to the threat vehicle. Okay, using a combination of these parameters, C and R, where the C threat victim actually relates to the probability that a road user, which is victim, is struck by the threat vehicle. And this is how we actually get the probability, basically as a proportion of the distance, the risk distance traveled by the victim vehicle and the threat vehicle. And likewise, we also then estimate or use this factor R, which is the case fatality ratio of the victim of the crash, and as a function of the vehicle attributes, victim attributes, crash conditions, and so on. So this basically, represents the crash fatality ratio for different combinations of threat and victim users. And then we estimate the total fatalities based on the total distance traveled by the victim and threat vehicles and these parameters that we have identified. So using this, we tried understanding or simulating different scenarios of how if the proportion of trips increases for different modes. So we have a base case and we have a high bus where the scenario is that more trips are happening on bus. And when you say more trips, it's basically in terms of passenger kilometer. Likewise, high car scenario and high two-wheeler scenario. And what we are trying to see is, as the proportion of these modes increases, how is the fatality changing? And one can clearly see that the minimum or the maximum reduction that we can see in fatalities is with respect to high bus scenario. Okay, in all these figures also. If you look at all these fatalities of these victims of different classes, you'll see that we have maximum reduction for high bus scenario. So this clearly tells that pushing more people towards public transport, especially buses, is actually a win-win situation, both in terms of achieving a sustainable mobility system, but also in terms of reducing the number of deaths, the number of fatalities happening due to road accidents. So there is an interesting insight that we get, whereas for it's actually high for the high two-wheeler scenario. So having more two-wheelers is only going to increase the chances of fatalities of these vulnerable road users. So this is what we get from understanding the risk to different road users, especially the vulnerable road users. The last piece that we also did was estimating the physical activity by walking and cycling in Bangalore based on the travel survey data that we had in terms of what we call it as MET, metabolic equivalent task being done based on the amount of distance or the physical activity that is people are doing using walking and cycling. And what we could clearly see when we categorize this MET into low physical activity, moderate, and vigorous based on the MET values between less than 3 to 3 to 6 or greater than 6, we can clearly see that 35% of Bangaloreans are in the low physical activity, zone, and a high share of 52% are in the moderate, whereas there are only 13% people who are actually doing good, vigorous physical activity. So this clearly shows that there is still a good need to improve the usage of physically active modes like walking and cycling to make the population largely, physically active and have positive benefits of health because of that. The irony is that when in today's situation you have lesser people who are walking and cycling, they are actually at a higher risk due to more exposure to pollutants. So you may actually take on to cycling or walking as physical active modes with in the intention of having more physical exercise and so on, and keeping us more healthy. But in effect, since the share of walking cycling is less and there are more motorized vehicles which are emitting more emissions, the NMT mode users in the present context are at a higher risk of more exposure. So the gains that you get from walking and cycling get negated due to more exposure to pollutants. So people who are in cars who are polluting more are actually being affected less as compared to walking and cycling. Walkers and cyclists who are actually using sustainable modes, but they're at the receiving end of getting exposed to the pollutants more. So that's the big irony. And to overcome this irony, the only way is to increase the mode share of these sustainable modes and reduce the vehicle kilometers traveled by motorized modes, so that you get to a balance where walking and cycling really becomes a net positive in terms of the health impact. I think this is what I had to present. Thankfully I had more time, so I took more time, but hopefully there'll be some queries and questions that I can answer. Thank you. Over to you, Ambika.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful session. Actually, sir, you chat box in the YouTube.
Sorry.
One YouTube is there, so there are lots of questions are there in the chat box.
Oh, I haven't opened the YouTube link.
Okay, sir.
Is it possible for you to
yes, sir.
read the questions so that I can answer?
Otherwise, I can share that link with you in the message box.
Okay.
So
yeah,
you
can read. Okay, I'll just go to
you just go through it, and that will be better actually.
Okay, so I can. So I have to click on this YouTube link.
Yes, sir.
It says video unavailable. You can see my screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this one, sir?
The link, the YouTube link?
Yeah, YouTube link.
It says video unavailable.
The second one, sir?
Just a minute. Yeah. The link, the YouTube link. It says video unavailable.
The second one, sir?
Yeah. The link, the YouTube link. It says video unavailable. Okay. Sorry, there is a lot of time lag.
Yes, sir.
Not very convenient for me.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of lag in seeing this. I mean, I'm able to open it. Is there a way that you can read?
Yes, sure, sir. No problem, sir. I can read out.
Sorry.
Okay, sir. Sir, can you mute your YouTube?
I have closed it.
Okay, sir. No problem. So lots of questions are there, sir.
Yeah,
So I just go through a few of them. That
sure.
Adveshi Srivastava
Hmm.
explains that there are many vehicles which use solar, renewable energy,
Hmm.
but there is less interest of person. Why?
There
What
is
is major
less less
interest
interest
of person?
in using solar vehicles.
Yes. Why? What is major problem to in solar based vehicle?
Basically, they're electric vehicles. Yeah, correct. So at present, if you look at the electric vehicles and understand the factors that would influence the adoption of electric vehicles and purchase of electric vehicles by consumers. So one has to think in terms of consumer theory here, okay, and understand why this is why people are not adopting them. One is the cost of the vehicles. The Indian consumer, especially in terms of buying vehicles, is still very cost sensitive. Okay, so the cost of the vehicle, electric vehicles, is still very high, and this is primarily due to a larger cost of battery. Okay, so the cost of battery adding to the cost of vehicles, making it less attractive for people to use to buy uh, in terms of the the amount they're spending to get a vehicle. The other issue is the quality of vehicles, the choices that people have to buy a car. So today, if I think about buying a gasoline-based car, whether it is petrol or diesel car, one can see that there is a huge amount of choices available to a consumer as a consumer. You have different models, different vehicles, different sizes, different capacity, different distance range, mileage, etc., and so on. When you think about buying electric vehicle today, you really are not sure whether you'll get a equally good quality vehicle with all those factors that people really value being taken care well for electric vehicles. So in terms of consumer, you still don't have attractive choices. Attractive when I say in terms of features, quality of vehicle, as well as the cost. Okay, so there's a lot that can be done in terms of not just technological improvements, but also in terms of policies and interventions from government to ensure that this purchase behavior and adaptation behavior can be influenced by those policies and technological interventions. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, next question, Amika.
Next question from Moni Dev. Sir, what is the meaning of resiliency of transportation system?
Okay,
How
that's a
can
very
we
good.
achieve it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, in this presentation, I had so much of things. So the adaptation part I didn't present here, but if you actually see, what we did was, I'll take a case of urban flooding, which is what we actually researched in terms of improving disaster resiliency of transport system for Bengaluru. So the idea was uh, that if you take an extreme rainfall condition and estimate the flood levels in the whole city, okay. Normally, what happens is whenever the rain happens or whenever you have flooding situation, you suddenly see its impact on the transport system and our travel patterns. The vehicles get slower, the traffic jam becomes higher. Sometimes some roads where the flood level is high, we are not able to go through those roads, so you have to take a detour or take some alternative route and so on. So what you see impact of a situation like extreme rainfall or flooding on transport system is in terms of increased travel distances, increased travel time, reduction in the travel speed, and also some trips getting cancelled, which would otherwise happen on a normal working day. When you say trips getting cancelled, certain areas sometimes get heavily flooded, so people are not able to make any trips either out of those areas or going into those areas. So this is like cancellation of trips. Okay, So this is how it impacts the transport system. Now, the resiliency that we are talking about, the disaster resiliency of transport system, the aim is that can we still allow uh, the uh, the normal activities in a given area to happen almost at the same level as they would happen on a normal working day? Can the transport system still function at almost the similar parameter levels that you would see on a typical business as usual working day? Okay, so can we think about interventions? Okay, for example, increasing the drainage capacity of the stormwater drains along the road. Okay, uh, um, or having a redundant road network link or a transport network link to an area which is heavily flooded. So we actually evaluated a bundle of these interventions for Bangalore to see how we can improve upon these parameters of resiliency, which is travel time, travel distance, number of trips being made, and so on. And can we bring it to almost a level which is for a normal working day? That's what we mean by resiliency. Now, Northeast is prone to earthquakes. It's in high seismic zone. So if you think about resiliency in terms of disasters like earthquake, what we are trying to see is how is the possible impact of earthquake of certain intensity can be on the availability and the condition of the transport network. Can we assess that, which is what is vulnerability assessment? Can we assess that? Once we assess that, then one can solve and understand how and what kind of traffic management one can see. You also have to understand how the travel demand pattern will change if an earthquake happens. People will not be going to offices. Students will not be going to colleges. Your OD pattern will change. You'll have more trips to evacuation places. You'll have more trips to hospitals, and so on and so forth. So, understanding the vulnerability of the transport network due to earthquake, and then understanding the change in the demand pattern, travel demand pattern due to earthquake, and then using that to understand how traffic management can be done. This is what one can think about as improving the resiliency of transport system to situations like earthquake. Likewise, one can think about and discuss in terms of different types of disasters. Yeah, Ambika.
Yes, sir. Next question from Sheikh Sainuddin. Sir, what is your view on the opportunity we have in this lockdown condition to refurbish our transportation system to a sustainable transit system?
Okay. I actually felt, the lockdown period, and it still continues in many places, is a wonderful opportunity to infuse and ramp up the infrastructure intervention for sustainable modes. Okay. In a normal situation, doing construction work for a metro line or, adding a bus lane or a cycle lane or widening a footpath is difficult because it has impact. It disrupts the traffic flow for considerable time, and so on. So when presently the roads are empty, or they were quite empty during the initial lockdown period also, it was actually quite easy for the authorities to implement or speed up some of these infrastructure interventions of sustainable modes. That's the best way we could have utilized this time when the traffic was very low to bring in this infrastructure. And many countries across the world have actually done this during the lockdown period when the traffic volumes were less. They have brought in more cycle lanes, converted many roads into bus lanes, and so on and so forth. So I think that could have been a good use, but I don't think our city authorities and officials or policymakers have actually done that, unfortunately. Yes, Amrika.
Yes, the next question for Isha Ravija from SPA Bhopal. So, due to this pandemic, we have seen a model shift from public to private mobility in urban areas. So, how can shared mobility be made effective in the post-COVID world?
Yes, that's a very good question, and this is what actually I was telling also during my initial part of the presentation, that there is a clear risk if we think that we can go business as usual into the future. Okay, if we go with a clear thinking, just waiting for this corona pandemic to get over or vaccine to come and everybody gets vaccine, and then we are back to business as usual of traveling, business as usual of transport planning and so on, is going to make things worse. Okay, mainly because there would be, and there is already a increased shift towards personal mobility modes as compared to public transport, because public transport are seen as high risk modes presently. And that's why I laid and talked about those 9 core principles. First of all, and those 9 core principles actually cover all kinds of interventions that would ensure that these sustainable modes still remains relevant, especially public transport. Now, cycling automatically and even walking automatically becomes a good fit to be, good alternative modes in the COVID situation or post-COVID situation, mainly because you can maintain social distancing easily, as well as they don't have emissions and they are space efficient mode. They are actually sustainable mode. So it's actually fit well. But even then, people will not adopt cycling and walking if you have a present level of infrastructure being given where there are no cycle lanes, safe cycle lanes, where footpaths, their provision of footpaths, the quality of footpaths, width of footpath is bad in many cities and so on. So one has to really infuse better infrastructure so that people can adopt walking cycling mode. For public transport, of course, as long as we have to have this guideline of social distancing, with business as usual thinking and crowding levels, we cannot sustain public transport at all. And nobody, at least who have a choice of using a alternative vehicle, will go and adopt a public transport system. So what we have to do is we have to use a combination of measures. One is, for example, this whole need for travel, so that certain amount of the trip loads, aggregate trip loads are reduced as some people are not traveling, and so the crowding levels in the public transport systems can come down. Okay, so that it is easier to maintain social distancing. Second is bring in technological interventions, seamless and contactless payment systems and so on, and other precautionary measures, so that your travel experience is as contactless as possible. Of course, with the reduced demand, there will be a financial burden on public transport system. So this is where the direct government subsidy are very important to ensure that these public transport systems are financially viable also. So with these sets of things that one can do with public transport as well as with walking and cycling, we can still ensure that, or we can still, make sure that we reverse this negative trend happening right now of more and more people adopting personal mobility vehicles. Ambika.
Yes. So next question from Kirtiman Roy. So don't you think the sustainable transport measures are anti-globalization? Restricting mobility will have economic aftermath.
Can you repeat, Ambika?
Yes, sir. Don't you think that sustainable transport measures are anti-globalization?
Anti-civilization,
Globalization.
anti-globalization.
Yes, sir. Then restricting mobility will have economic aftermath.
Okay, that's an interesting point of view. But I would not agree that, and again, when Prime Minister also said focusing on vocal for local, it's not about, becoming totally, inward looking and close the door of globalization and so on. It's a fine balance that one can think about. When we say vocal for local, or when we are saying more and more focus on sustainable modes, reducing distances to travel, it's mainly to see that the externalities due to transport systems are less and less. The burden on transport system is reduced, I mean, just to give an example, our Indian Railways, we still see a situation where months before the actual date of travel for a given train, the reservations are completely out and you are in long waiting list. Why this happens? It's also because there's too much of travel demand that we have all throughout the year, mainly because of this disproportionate spread of opportunities that people have to travel long distances, then again travel for their other purposes and so on, and that puts a heavy burden on the transport system also. Okay, uh, uh, because of the need to travel so much. So if you can reduce that, you are essentially making the transport system work at a better level of service. Now, at the same time, it doesn't mean that you are globally cut off. Okay, with this whole advent of these online systems, faster communication, connected world, and so on, we can still remain globally connected, transit globally, have interactions and communications globally, but at the same time doesn't allow those interactions to lead to a lower quality transport system or higher externalities of transport system. So I think a good balance of measures would help us achieve both. Creating a sustainable transport system at the same time, doesn't compromise on the economic activity. This is what actually I was saying when I was showing the curve between the GDP per capita and the car ownership per thousand population. The fact that India is still at a lower level of this S-shaped curve actually gives us a lot of opportunity and challenge, so that we can decouple the economic growth, grow economically, but doesn't allow the car ownership to grow anymore. Yeah, over to you, Ambika.
Yes, sir. Next question from Anna Varghese, that now due to COVID-19, world is using private more than public. How
I
it
think,
will affect the
yeah.
future transportation system?
So I think I've already, there was a similar question earlier also, so I've kind of already answered this question.
The next question is from Raga. So how do we address the pedestrian safety, especially at crossing, when we emphasize mobility as sustainable transport mode?
Yeah. So, to some extent, I touched upon this in my later part of the presentation also, where I was, showing about this whole fatality, crash data that we had from Bangalore and the scenario analysis that we did. There are multiple ways in which we can improve the safety of vulnerable road users. One is increasing their mode share. If you have more people or more trips happening on walking and cycling, you will automatically see that the conflict situations between vehicular traffic and the NMT modes, especially pedestrians, will come down substantially when you have more and more people adopting to walking and cycling. That's one way in which we can reduce the conflict. The other thing that I also came from the result is pushing more people towards public transport system. Again, would ensure that you have lesser vehicles and lesser situations of conflict between the vehicular movement and the pedestrian movements. Of course, safe and good quality infrastructure for pedestrians is the bare minimum requirement in any situations. Why we have no safe crossings? I mean, ideally we should have safe crossings at every junction in the city for pedestrians, and every regular intervals on a straight mid block section or a corridor. In the absence of these safe crossing facilities and safe infrastructure, pedestrians tend to take risk, since they have to move in any case, of taking risky crossing maneuvers and other kinds of situations, risking themselves to the potential of getting in conflict with the vehicular traffic. So I think these bundle of things, if one can do, it would mainly ensure better safety for pedestrians. Ambika.
Yes, sir. So lots of questions are there. Can I go through all those questions?
Yeah, as long as you have time.
Okay, 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 sir. So, So next question from again Kirtiman Roy. Also in a country like India, where electricity is mostly generated by thermal power plants, don't you think electric vehicles would not be able to cut down population pollution up to our expectation?
Yeah, that's why I clearly say, and this is why we took different scenarios of the share of renewable and non-renewable sources of electricity to drive down this point. As long as the electricity is produced from non-renewable sources and not clean sources, electric vehicles would still be polluting vehicles, although the pollution may not be happening at the point of consumption, but at the point of production. So it's very important when we think about promoting electric vehicles or infusing more electric vehicles, we also need to clean up the source of electricity. It's extremely important for a clearly holistic, clean air or clean vehicle policy. So that's very important. Yes, Amrita.
Yes,
Next
so
question.
another question is from Ashok Bellary. Dear sir, what is the best approach to reduce the congestion in two-tier cities in the country?
Please repeat.
Yes, sir. What is the best approach to reduce the congestion?
To reduce the congestion. Okay,
Yes.
so I've already presented the best way or approach, and I will again repeat that today's so it has to be a good combination of bottom up and top down. When I say bottom up, this is the traditional way of looking at transportation planning and engineering, where we focus on problem points and problem locations. For example, in a given city, we will try to identify congestion points by calculating the V by C ratio. Okay, and then trying to see how do I solve those, or remove these congestion points, without realizing that while I may remove the congestion point here by improving the V by C at this point, but I may be shifting the problem somewhere else because of the kind of the supply based measures and the effect that it does. Okay, so clearly it has been seen over years with research and also with experience in the cities that this bottom up approach is no more sustainable, where we only need to more road widening, flyovers, underpasses, elevated corridors, and so on, and they only keep inducing more and more vehicular traffic and increasing the vehicle kilometers traveled. Okay, so we need to think and bring in the top-down approach also, which means that when you say top-down, you're basically setting the goals correctly and rightly. And the goal is, for example, from the kilometer transfer to make Bangalore or Indian cities more livable. That's our goal. And then from that goal, you start coming down in terms of how different measurable indicators can be used to see how much we are achieving the goal from the interventions that we are trying to do. So by having this combination of bottom up and top down approach, you would ensure that not just the measures would elevate or improve the core transportation system problems, but would also take care of reducing the externalities connected to transportation system, which is exhaust emissions, health impact, impact on quality of life and things like that. So focusing on minimizing the vehicle kilometers traveled by all motorized modes over the whole network is actually a shift today we have from how we used to do transport planning by just focusing on V by C. Yeah, Ambika.
So next question from Malik Ali. Is this called Delphi approach?
Is this
Called Delphi approach?
Delphi?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't go into the details and the methodology of the Delphi approach. Basically, in the Delphi method, we take a iterative approach of taking inputs of stakeholders by throwing certain initial set of situations and asking the stakeholders to evaluate and weigh them or prioritize them, and then summing up, again throwing it back to the stakeholders, asking them to see and revise their choices or the inputs that we made, and do this iteration till you achieve a final set of outcomes that are acceptable to all stakeholders. This is what exactly we did while arriving at the final set of bundle 1, bundle 2, bundle 3, what interventions will go in these bundles through this Delphi approach. Okay, so one can refer to any textbook or a reference material to see how Delphi method is actually done and worked. Yeah, Ambika.
So next question from Chirag Alwat. Sir, we know what is going wrong and how we can change it. But living in India, implementing change is one of the hardest things because we engineers understand how important it is, but the government body ignores.
Correct. So that's where the point is, and I also mentioned somewhere in between that having a reform governance structure of of transport is extremely important to realize what we understand from our research and technical understanding. Clearly, there is a gap in what policy making is happening, what's happening in policy making, and what we are understanding from research. And why this gap is, one is communicating. We as engineers and planners, as technical people, need to develop capability to explain these technical things in a more simple way, in a more understandable way to practitioners, to policymakers, to government, officials. Nobody would really be interested in seeing the mathematics of what we do and the complex, equations and models that we develop. So, it's up to us to first of all develop this ability, and it all comes with experience. Nobody is born. Engineers are typically not good in communicating well in a easy and simple way. So that is something that we have to focus more and more. And wherever opportunity comes, we need to throw this or present this or inform this to the policymakers and government officials. Personally, I take a lot of effort in doing that. In fact, this Climatron study that I talked about, I've gone and given these reports and presented them to the chief minister, other officials, citizens representatives, and so on. And in many ways, it does at least push things in the right direction. Of course, these things takes time, but these efforts have to go on. That's one thing. Second thing is reforming the whole structure of governance of transport system. So cities really need a more integrated. If you look at the transport, there are multiple agencies you will see who are handling the transport functions. It will be PWD, it will be Development Authority, it will be corporation, it will be bus transport undertakings, traffic police, and so on. Each one of them not talking to each other and not integrating their actions or efforts or interventions together. Okay. So unless we create an institutional framework where these functions are integrated, we'll keep seeing this kind of disconnect between what we understand in the research and what's actually happening on the ground. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, but I think these are the things that we have to probably see to make a more impactful, situation where our research can translate into actions. Ambika.
Yes, sir. Sir, lots of questions are there. It will take another 1 hour to.
Yeah, maybe two more questions. Yeah, then we can.
Okay, sir. Thank you. So next question for Subin Babu. Sir, is there any clear update on the amount of reduction in pollution during lockdown?
Is there a clear
Update on the amount of reduction in pollution.
Of course. So we have. So if you actually collect the data from different government websites, especially who monitor these sensors at different locations for different cities. For example, we did collect this data of daily pollution levels in some of the selected Indian cities over time period of the lockdown and how this is actually reduced. So these are available on different pollution control websites, Central Pollution Control Board or State Pollution Control Board. and one can see and understand how these trends. In fact, we have seen that over this lockdown period, especially in the March, April, May, time, uh, uh, we have seen data of Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore. The concentration levels of the pollutants actually came down quite below the national standards. Okay, which you would never see during the usual, pre-COVID, a normal working day situation where these concentration levels are quite high. So there have been a measured, noticeable improvement in the quality of air. And it was also clear, for example, from these news that the mountain ranges, Himalayan mountain ranges, are certainly visible from a town which is more than 200 kilometers away. It's only because the pollution has reduced so much and the air is clean that even the visibility has increased so much. Yes, Ambika, last question.
Yes, and last questions from Manish Datta. Can you suggest some research areas which would enable us in suggesting policy interventions for decentralizing organic cities? I
Okay.
guess this is one of the main cause of traffic congestion.
Yeah. So, of course, I mean, I'll give another to answer this question. I'll give context of Karnataka itself. If you look at the urbanization trend in Karnataka, the whole urbanization is centric to Bangalore. Okay, there's huge population growth, economic activity growth, etc. in Bangalore, but the rest of the cities in the state or rest of the places in the state doesn't neither have that population levels nor they have the economic activities. So it's clearly a skewed economic development and urbanization trend in the city. So if you have a situation, and we wrote a paper some 7-8 years back on how a high speed connectivity across the state of Karnataka, a network of high speed connectivity, say through and we focused on high speed rail. With these faster connections, you can actually induce a more equitable and spread out growth in the economic opportunities and the population also. And it could actually be a good way to decongest the Bangalore city itself by, say, for example, Mysore is a important town closer to Bangalore, about 150 kilometers or so. If you have a high-speed rail connectivity with which you can commute in, say, 30 minutes or 40 minutes, which is actually a much lesser commuting time as compared to somebody from South Bangalore traveling to North Bangalore, where it takes 1 hour, sometimes more than 1 hour. So if you have a faster connectivity, many companies can actually locate themselves to Mysore, where the cost of establishment would be lower. Somebody who is living in Bangalore can live in Mysore and travel to Bangalore. Likewise, so there are a lot of ways in which using transport, a faster transport connectivity, faster and good quality transport connectivity as a catalyst to enable this decentralization or decongestion of major metropolitan cities. Again, this is thinking about vocal for local concept in a transport and land use sense. So these kind of interventions can actually ensure that we decongest the existing overburdened cities and create a more sustainable spread of economic opportunities and population growth. Yeah, that's all, Amika.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for your valuable time, sir.
My pleasure.
This
My pleasure.
is a nice session, sir. I think
Sir,
I enjoyed
uh,
that.
sir, I'm extremely happy. We are extremely happy that on our online request, you have extended your lecture from 1 hour to 2 hours. Excellent, sir. We'll like to, sir, we'll like to have you in NIT Silchar after the pandemic is over. It is an open
Yes,
invitation.
yes,
We'll
yes.
be delighted to receive you in NIT Silchar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ambika, please take it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. So I can close the meeting now, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
yes.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Sir.
So, after this wonderful session, we are coming to our last speaker of the day. So, here's Dr. K.H. Lakshman Singh. So, just a brief introduction about him that he works as an assistant of professor at NIT Silchar. He obtained his PhD from IIT Roorkee, bachelor's and master's from MNIT Jaipur. He served as a junior engineer for 2 years with Sikkim government. His research interests are pavement analysis and design, highway construction, pavement evaluation, bituminous material characterization, and highway maintenance. Specialization in the transportation engineering, he teaching almost over the 10 years. So he was one of the few researchers in the early 2000s working on rheology of bituminous binder in India. So now we are here to hear from you, sir. The now platforms is yours.
Checking audio, sir. Checking audio.
Hello,
Yeah.
is audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ambika. So, I'm really thankful to the NIT Silchar for giving me an opportunity to share my knowledge in this webinar series. So, today I would like to present a topic on the study on rheological properties of modified and unmodified bituminous binder. So, very good noon to all, and thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak this topic. So, first of all, I would like to mention about outlines of the presentation. Big picture. My video is coming?
No, sir. This PPT is coming.
No.
No.
Not coming?
Not coming.
Okay. So that I can read it. So if video is coming, then it's not.
No.
Okay.
The screen is coming.
Okay. Okay. Sorry for the disturbance. So I would like to mention about the outlines of the presentation is that here I will discuss only the importance of bitumen and the modified bitumen and the rheological properties and not discuss about the bitumen mixes. So the main outline of the presentation is bitumen, grade of bitumen, modified bitumen, classification of bitumen, modifier, classification of modified bitumen, performance grading system, and physical properties of modified bitumen, penetration index, aging of bituminous binder, superbed test method and equipments, rheology of the bituminous binder, and rheological properties of modified bituminous binder. Then the performance grade of different polymer modified bitumen, then complex modulus, phase angle with temperature, effect of aging on modified bituminous binder, and then lastly, the temperature susceptibility of bituminous binder will be in this presentation. So first of all, I would like to mention about the bitumen. So bitumen is very important part of the flexible pavement because it plays a very important role. That's why it is very important to know what is actually bitumen. So bitumen is a hydrocarbon material. Generally, it is found in gaseous, liquid, semi-solid, and solid form. And it is obtained artificially during the distillation of petroleum. So the bitumen as a binder play a key role in the performance-related properties of bituminous mixes. Then the bituminous binder, which is used for the construction of road and other structure, it is because of its binder and waterproofing properties. Therefore, the composition of the pure bitumen has primary influence on their mechanical behavior, which is in turn very sensitive to stress, strain rate, and the temperature. So now comes the grade of bitumen. So as per IS specification, there are two types of grade of bitumen. They are paving grade bitumen, which are used for the pavement construction of work of roads and airfields. And second one is industrial grade bitumen, and this bitumen is generally used for waterproofing of structure and industrial floor, etc. So now comes the modified bitumen. So this one question is that why bitumen is needed to modify, and how the modified bitumen can be used in the road construction. Therefore, first of all, we have to know what is bitumen modifier and the modified bitumen. So the properties of bitumen and the bituminous mixes really can be improved to meet requirements of incorporating of certain additives or blend additives. So these additives are called bitumen modifier, and the bitumen premixed with this modifier is known as modified bitumen. And here I am showing the classification of bitumen modifier as per IS specifications. So as per this IS, it is divided into three parts. One is synthetic polymer, synthetic rubber, other rubber. And in the synthetic polymer, two types are there. That is elastomeric thermoplastic, elastomeric thermoplastic, and synthetic rubber is synthetic rubber latex, and other rubbers, they are natural rubber, crumb rubber. So the polyethylene ethylene phenyl acetate EVA, these are comes in the examples of elastomeric thermoplastic. And again, that SPS, it is very commonly used in the modification of the bitumen, that is styrene butadiene styrene, is also come in the examples of elastomeric thermoplastics. And now synthetic rubber latex, that is styrene butadiene rubber latex and any other suitable synthetic rubber. And latex or rubber powder comes in the natural rubber, and crumb rubber powder from discarded truck tire is also come in the example of the crumb rubber. So as per IS 15462, that modified can be classified as PMB P40, PMB P70, PMB 120, PMB E40, PMB E70, PMB E120, NRMP 40, NRMP 70, NRMP 120, CRMP 50, CRMP 55, CRMP 60. So that PMB P means elastomeric and E means elastomeric. So these three grades of the polymer modified bitumen is really based on the penetration value. The PMB 40, it indicates, it means that the penetration value is varies from 30 to 50. And similarly, for the case of the natural rubber modified bitumen B is indicated, its penetration value is 30 to 50. But in the case of CRMB 50 and CRMB 55 and CRMB 60, this is based on the softening point value. The CRMB 50 means the softening point of this modified binder will be minimum 50. So now come to the advantage of modified bitumen. Because of some advantage of the modified bitumen, it is commonly used in the pavement construction. So the advantage of this modified bitumen are it has lower susceptibility to daily and seasonal temperature variations, higher resistance to deformation at elevated pavement temperature, and it gives better between aggregate and the binder. It also shows higher fatigue life of mixes. It gives delay of cracking, includes reflective cracking, overall improved performance in extreme climatic conditions and heavy traffic conditions. So in the country, there are various types of bitumen have been used in the road constructions, but without knowing the properties, it cannot be used in the pavement constructions. Therefore, the binder which are using in the road construction has to be tested. So there are some tests given like penetration, softening point, ductility, viscosity, extrusion gravity, flash at fair point, and loss on heating test, etc. So now comes the grading system. So in the country earlier, the grade of bitumen is based on penetration value. That is like 30, 40, 60, 70, 85, 100. But this type of grading system is only based on the penetration value. Actually, the penetration value is measured at 25 degrees Celsius. So the grading system based on this penetration value is not giving a full picture or could not full describe properly the properties of the bituminous binder. So the BIS developed a new techniques that is called viscosity grading, which is based on 60 degrees Celsius and 135 degrees Celsius. Because the road pavement surface sometimes is reached up to 60 degrees Celsius, and the mixes of the bituminous mixes is taken 135 degrees Celsius. So this type of grading system is more reliable than the bitumen grading system based on penetration value. Therefore, nowadays this type of grading system is commonly used. So the viscosity grading is PG10, PG20, PG30, and PG40. The PG10 is also equivalent to 80 by 100 penetration value, and PG20 is 60 to 80, PG30 50 to 60, PG40 40 to 50. So now come to the another performance grading system. So in other developed countries or European countries, the performance grading system is developed under the superfab. So the asphalt binder grading system in superfab is called performance grading system, that is also known as a PC. So it is a product of the Strategic Highway Research Program, SSRP of USA. All PG binders are characterized based on fundamental engineering parameters. It accounts for the impact of climatic factor and binder characteristics at both the hot and cold temperature regimes. So example of this grading system is PG46, PG52, PG58, PG64, PG70, PG76, PG82. So in order to characterize, then we have to see the properties of the modified binder using a different additives. So now come to the physical properties of bitumen modified with SPS and EVA. So from this table, it can be seen that the addition of additives or bitumen modifier, how much it can change the properties of the bituminous binder. See that bitumen only without any additives, the penetration value it comes 63. But while it is at 3% of the SPS, it comes 50. And in the point of sounding point, it is found 49.5. But after addition of 3% SPS, it comes 61. So similarly, in the case of EVA, 9%, it comes 32 for the penetration value, and 78.2, it comes in sounding point. That means it indicates that their properties has been changed drastically by addition of the modifier. Now comes the penetration index. Actually, that penetration index is also measured the temperature susceptibility of the bituminous binder. And this temperature susceptibility can be measured from the two parameters like summoning point and the penetration value. So now from this figure, it can be seen that the variation of penetration index with modifier of 60-70 grad bitumen. And here we can see penetration index is more than 2 and less than 2. See, most of the bituminous binder modified with crumb rubber is less than 2, and the EBA modified binder and SPS modified binder is above the penetration index above 2. So that means with increasing percentage of modifier, the PI value is also increased. That SPS modified binder gives the highest value of PI with the same percentage of additive as compared to SIA and the EVA. So as per specifications, greater than 2 PI is taken as blonde bitumen, and the bitumen which are using in the pavement construction will be -2 to +2, and less than -2 is temperature susceptible bitumen like at towers. That soft bitumen will come under this PI. So now come to the aging of bituminous binder. So why aging is so important to study the properties of the bituminous binder? As we know that the surface of the pavement is always exposed to the different climatic conditions and always exposed to the different loading systems. Therefore, the binder which are using in the pavement surface should have a such type of loadings and the climatic conditions. So the aging of bituminous binder occurs during mixing and the laydown process and during service. It is divided into 2 types. One is short-term aging, and second one is long-term aging. So first of all, let us discuss about short-term aging. Actually, this short-term aging is considered for the constructions of the structure or construction of the pavements, that is during a short period. So this short-term aging is generally evaluated by using thin film oven test and rolling thin film oven test. And in the case of long-term aging, it is generally indicates during the first 5 to 10 years of service life, and it can be measured by pressure aging vessels. And this type of PAP is used to simulate the physical and chemical property changes that occur in bitumen. So in order to find out the different types of properties and the characterization of the bituminous binder, we have to use high-tech techniques, and different types of methods and equipment should be used. Therefore, PEP test method and equipment is necessary to consider in the finding the properties of the bituminous binder. So the PEP test method and equipments are here. The direct tension test, which is used for determining the fracture properties of asphalt binder, and that procedure is followed by ASTO TV2. And it also measures binder properties at low surface temperature, and it indicates the resistance to thermal cracking. And bending beam rheometer, this test is used for determining the fracture quick stiffness of asphalt binder, and it is the procedure is followed by ASTO TP1, and it has a purpose that measure binder properties at low surface temperature, and each parameter can be used for resistance to thermal cracking. Now comes the dynamic shear rheometer. It is very important part for determining the real skin properties. So it can be measured the real skin properties of bituminous binder, and this procedure is taken under ASTO TV5. And the main purpose of this DSR is to measure binder properties at high and intermediate temperature. And this parameter, it can measure the resistance of permanent deformation rating and fatigue cracking. And now come to the pressure etching vessels. It is practiced for accelerated etching of asphalt binder using a pressurized etching vessels. And the main purpose is it can be simulated binder etching during SMA service life. And this performance parameter can be resistance to etching during service life, that is 5 to 10 years. Now come to the rheology of the binder. This is very important part of the bituminous binder. So before knowing this, we should know what is actually rheology of the binder. So rheology can be defined as that the flow characteristics and the deformation of the matter. Then it's also known rheology of binder. Therefore, rheology is very important field of study for asphalt technologies. Earlier, we have used that conventional tests like penetration, summoning point, and the extra have been used for characterization of bitumen. But these tests are not satisfactory for rheological characterization of the binder. Therefore, the strategic highway research program SSRB developed a new specification for rheological characterization of the binder. So here I am showing some parameters which can characterize of the bitumen. So in the rheological characterization of the bituminous binder, it will be discussed like complex modulus, storage modulus, loss modulus, and the phase angle. So this parameter is generally used for the characterization of the bituminous binder as per SSRP. So phase angle measures the viscoelastic character of the bitumen. A purely viscous liquid and an ideal elastic solid demonstrate the phase angle of 90 degree and the 0 degree respectively. So come to the rheological properties of bituminous binder. So why rheological properties is so important? Because it's not a full picture to characterize of the bituminous binder. Therefore, the rheological characterizations by using dynamic shear rheometer is giving a fully properties in order to find out the properties of the bituminous binder. Therefore, dynamic shear rheometer is used for determination of the rheological properties of bitumen in a wide range of temperature. So this test is conducted as per guidelines prescribed as to TB 5/1994. Here I am showing a picture of the dynamic shear rheometer and the components of the SR5 SR rheometer. So the components of this rheometer is air dryer, control module, test station, environmental controller, and the personal computer. So air dry means the air which is coming from the air compressors is filter and dry it. And the test station is houses the stress head, fluid part, and all support electronics. And environmental controller is used to control the temperature of the test station. And here I am showing the plate which are using in the DSR. So these two plates is 25 mm parallel plates. So here I am showing some latest dynamic shear rheometer like SmartWave 102, 302 products of the Aten part. So now come to the principle and operation of DSR. Actually, the bitumen is sandwiched between two parallel plates, which one is fixed and other oscillate. So from this figure, we can see that as the plate oscillates, the center line point A of the oscillating plate moves to a point B. From the point B, the plate moves to a point C and ultimately moves back to a point A. The movement of the center line from point A to point A is called as one cycle. This cycle is continuously repeated in the TSR operation. And actually, the rheometer can describe the linear viscoelastic properties of this binder over a wide range of temperature and loading times. During testing, a sinusoidal shear stress is applied to a sample of bitumen sandwiched between two parallel plates. The resulting sinusoidal shear stress is monitored as a function of temperature and frequency. Based on this stress and the strain measurements, stiffness and viscosity can be obtained at different temperature, frequencies, and the strain level of the samples of bitumen. So in the dynamic rheometer, it had 25 mm plate was used for the measurements in different temperatures from 46 degree to 82 degree Celsius. All the binders were tested at frequency 10 radian per second to determine the performance grade of formulations. So the specification purposes sinusoidal loading to the specimen at a frequency 10 radian per second corresponds to a traffic speed at 80 km per hour. So let's see the scope of the DSR. Actually, it is used for specification purposes to measure the complex modulus and the phase angle of asphalt binder at intermediate to upper pavement service temperature and the frequency of 10 radian per second, where the complex modulus is approximately 10 MVA or larger. So in the DSR, the bitumen binder are viscoelastic in nature, and the response of bitumen to stress depends upon the rate of loading and the temperature. In short time or elastic behavior, there is no time difference between the stress and the strain. And in the case of viscous materials, there is a long time response between stress and the strain. Therefore, a perfectly elastic material exhibits a phase angle of 0, while viscous material exhibit an angle of 90 degrees. Therefore, an elastic materials exhibit maximum shear stress and a maximum shear strain at the same time, while for a perfectly viscous material, maximum shear stress occurs at the same time as minimum shear strain. So, an asphalt then to elastic at all temperature at that time will be, the phase angle will be 0, and the viscous conditions, it indicates the phase angle of 90 degrees at very high temperature. So the principle of operation DSR and the relationship between shear stress and the shear strain for elastic and viscous material also considered in the DSR. And now come to the specification values of the DSR, that while testing any binder in the DSR, we can use parallel plate symmetry used for the specification testing, and all the testing will be done at frequency 10 radian per second. That is also used in the IS 2004. The stiffness value G star sin del, that is also known as shear modulus of the binder, should be greater than 2.2 kPa after the RTF or T at the maximum pavement design temperature. And similarly, the G star pi sin del of the tank or originate unless bitumen must be greater than 1 kPa at the same pavement temperature. See, in our country, as per the IS specifications, that different types of BMP has been tested in the rheometer as one. BMP 120 is tested at 52 degrees Celsius, and BMP 70 is also tested at 58 degrees Celsius, and BMP 40 is also measured at 70 degrees Celsius. So now come to the reversible properties of SDS modified bituminous binder. Here I want to show that how much the rheological properties can be affected by addition of the SPS. In the case of that original binder at 60-70 bitumen, it has 3.78 complex modulus at 58 degrees Celsius, and at 70 degrees Celsius, it is found 0.80. Here I mention two temperatures for 58 and 70 degrees Celsius because as per IS specifications, according to the grade of the bitumens, so it is taken at 58 and 70 degrees Celsius. So here at 70 degrees Celsius for original binder is found 0.80. And see, in the case of phase angle, it is over 93.2 degrees. Therefore, the original binder tested in the rheometer, their value is exceeding 93, the phase angle. Therefore, this binder has been failed. And in the case of addition of 3% SPS at 58 degrees Celsius, it is found at 0.95 complex modulus, and 70 degrees Celsius 2.26. And see the phase angle. At 58 degrees Celsius, it is found 73.7, and in the case of 70 degrees Celsius, it is found that phase angle is 83.3. So from these 2 points, it can be seen easily that by addition of the additives to the bituminous binder, it really can be changed the rheological properties of the bituminous binder. And now here I'm showing the rheological properties of EBA modified bituminous binder. And here also we can see the values is changes drastically by addition of the EBA. That means the bituminous binder also can be fully affected by addition of the EBA modifier. And here, similarly, I'm showing the rheological properties of drum rubber modified bituminous binder. And here, we can see the changes by addition of drum rubber. 70 degrees Celsius, it is found 2.93 kPa. And in the case of phase angle, at 58 degrees Celsius, it is found 67.5. And at 70 degrees Celsius, it is found 68.89. So from these observations also, we can find out that how much it can be affect the properties of the bituminous binder by addition of drum rubber. So now come to the relationship between G star, sign tail, and the temperature. So here I'm showing the relationship between G star sign tail measured at 10 radian per second as a function of temperature for 67 between modified with drum rubber before aging. So as per superbed performance grade of bitumen is also based on climate. The performance-based SHRP specifications has suggested different grade of bituminous binder on the basis of G star by sign tail. The temperature at which this parameter attains a value of 1 kPa before aging of the binder and 2.2 kPa after aging is termed as the performance grade PG of the binder. So this figure shows a relationship between that shear modulus versus temperature. So from this figure, it can be seen that the shear modulus is also decreases with increase in temperature. So now come to the shear modulus G star by sign tail with temperature measured at 10 radian per second for EBA modified binder before aging. So from here also most of the modified binder is above 1 kPa. And similarly, this figure shows the relationship between the G star sign del measure at 10 radian as a function of temperature for SPS modified binder before aging. And here I am showing again the same properties, but which are using the 8500 vitamin modified with SPS before aging. Here this test is tested before aging, therefore the minimum that G star by sign 10 will be 1 kPa, and in the case of aging of the modified binder is taken, minimum is 2.2 kPa. So from these two figures, we can find out the performance grading system. So here I'm showing some performance grade of different polymer modified bitumen. Here we can see the temperature corresponding to G star sin del equal to 1 kPa, G star sin del equal to 2.2 kPa. In the case of original binder, it has been shown 60 and 64.5. So as per performance grade, as per SSRP specification comes under PG64. And in the case of EVA modification, let us see at 5% EVA, it comes, before aging, it comes 83.5 kVA, and this thing G star sin del equal to 2.2, it comes 82. Therefore, this performance grade becomes PG82. So similarly, like this, we can find out all the different percentages of modifier added to the bitumen for EVA modified with 8500 grade bitumen and SPS also. So here I'm showing the relationship between complex modulus and phase angle with temperature. So from this figure, we can find out the viscoelastic behavior of the bituminous binder, because the phase angle is also used to measure the viscoelastic properties of the bituminous binder. So here this figure shows the relationship between complex modulus and phase angle with temperature. See, the complex modulus is decreased with increased temperature, and the phase angle increase with increased temperature. It indicates that when the temperature is increased, the phase angle is increased, means their elasticity properties decrease as the temperature is increased. And in the case of complex modulus, it decreases when the temperature rises. That means their resistance to deformation is decreased when the temperature rises. I'll come to the relationship between loss modulus and storage modulus with temperature. And actually, the binder should have large value of storage modulus G gas at high temperature for deformation resistance, because G star or G gas measure the binder elasticity. Therefore, decrease in elasticity of the binder and low temperature facilities in FOIT cracking, as the absorbed energy is more easily dissipated. So, at low elasticity is suitable at low temperature to facilitate dissipation, but high elasticity is convenient at high temperature to avoid viscous flow of the binder. So, the loss modulus G double gas and the storage modulus G gas of the modified binder at different temperature can be measured. So This figure shows that complex modulus and the storage modulus with different percentages of EVA have been evaluated at different temperatures. So from here, it can be seen that the storage and the loss modulus decreases with increase with the temperature. So for the case of modified bitumen with EVA, a storage modulus is dominated at temperature lower than 64 degrees Celsius and above this temperature. Loss modulus is dominated for higher percentage of modifier, that is 9%. It indicates that higher percentage of EVA shows fully elastic behavior of the bituminous binder at temperature lower than 64 degrees Celsius. But in the case of 3%, 5%, 7% of EVA indicates viscous behavior of binder as dominated by loss modulus. Now come to the aging effect of modified binder. Actually, the bitumen aging is traditionally evaluated by means of aging index, which is defined as the ratio of the physical or rheological parameters of the S bitumen to that of the original bitumen. For the case of the conventional bitumens, high values of ratio indicate high degree of bitumen hardening. So the aging index is determined from the ratio of the complex modulus of S, that is TMOT binder, to the complex modulus of an S binder in the present study. So all the values of the aging index at different temperatures and 10 radian per second is evaluated. The value of aging index from these results, it indicates that aging index for modified binder may be higher or lower than 1 depending upon the temperature and the frequency considered. So this figure is also the relationship between the complex modulus temperature for gum rubber modified bitumen. Again, now comes the temperature susceptibility. This is also a very important parameter which can provide the rheological properties of the bituminous binder. The temperature susceptibility is also decreases with increase the percentage of modifier. So from this figure, it can be seen that the SPS modified binder has shown a higher temperature susceptibility. And this also shows the relationship between dynamic viscosity and the temperature. And from this figure, it can be seen that the viscosity decreases with increased temperature. That means with increase in the percentage of modifier has a lower temperature with a higher temperature susceptibility. Now, I would like to conclude from the above studies that the physical properties of bitumen, such as penetration, softening point, elastic recovery, are improved with addition of the polymer from rubber. ASPS modified binder gives higher softening point and better elastic recovery than EVA and CR modified binder. Higher value of elastic recovery indicates for flexibility to the binder and will increase the life of the pavement at lower temperature. The penetration index PI is also increased with increase in percentage of modifier. The SPS modified binder gives the highest value of PI with the same percentage of modifier as compared to drum rubber and EVA modified binder. So the complex modulus, shear modulus, and the loss modulus are found to be in important roles to characterize the rheological properties and predict the performance of modified bitumen at high temperature. The complex modulus increases with increase in percentage of modifier and decreases with increase in temperature. However, phase angle decreases with increase in percentage of modifier and increases with increase in temperature. Phase angle of modified binder also decreases as compared to the net bitumen. The increase in complex modulus and decrease in phase angle of the modified binder indicate higher resistance to deformation as compared to net bitumen. The temperature susceptibility of the modified binder is lower than net bitumen, and the increase in percentage of modifier decreases temperature susceptibility. Therefore, the rheological properties of bituminous binder also changes by using the aging modified binder. So, from the present study, it is observed that the value of complex modulus, shear modulus, loss modulus for EBM binder are found to be higher than SPS and the gram number modified binder. So, EBM modified binder can be used in very high temperature and the traffic areas. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for giving an insight in the rheological of the binder. So now lots of questions in the chat box. We can see. So just can you answer all these questions right now, sir?
No, I cannot see it.
Yes, so
Just pass the question.
I will give the question. Huh?
Yeah.
So first question is from Lakshmi Narayan R. Respected sir, is there any specific reason for grading CRMB based on softening point instead of penetration value?
Madam, repeat the question again.
Is there any specific reason for grading CRMB based on softening point instead of penetration value?
No, it is as per ISO specification that CRMB specification is based on the softening point only, and the other PFPs and NRP values that is based on the penetration values only.
Next question. Sir, what is the difference between storage modulus and loss modulus from Lakshmi Narayan?
Okay, actually, in the rheological properties, that the storage modulus and loss modulus is quite different. Actually, the loss modulus indicates it measures the resistance to deformation, and storage modulus, it indicates the elasticity of the binder. So if you find out these two values from the rheometer, so that you can indicate the elasticity of the bituminous binder also.
The next question from Ankush Kumar. As mentioned in the first slide, bitumen is also found in gaseous form. Does it refer to the gaseous from during the production process, or gaseous bitumen is commercially available?
Okay, this is very nice question. Actually, that gaseous form is before production of the bitumen.
Okay, thank you, sir, for your nice presentation. So, yes, sir. No questions is there, sir. So, thank you for your kind presentation. So, today we're at the end of our day session. So, a great session of today comes to an end. It was a fruitful and thought-provoking session today. I would take the opportunity to thank the experts of today's session. I would like to thank all the distinguished speakers for rendering their valuable time and benefiting our participants with such magnificent knowledge and guidance. Thanking you all, I conclude today's session. See you in the same time. Have a good day.